It's the 2nd of December 1942, and we're in a squash court beneath the stands of the University of Chicago's football field in the United States. Outside this room, the Second World War is raging, bringing death and destruction across the globe. Inside these walls, in strict secrecy, some of the world's most brilliant scientists have gathered to perform a crucial experiment, one that will forever change the course of science and history. For over 2 weeks, these scientists have been assembling what's known as the Chicago Pile 1, the world's first nuclear reactor. No cooling towers, no vast industrial site. Instead, a 20-foot tall pile of graphite threaded with hundreds of uranium blocks, a sort of brick cube with holes fitting cadmium control rods. And then the moment arrives. At 3:53 p.m., the metallic clicking of the scientists' instruments marks the achievement of the world's first controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. These men are working on the Manhattan Project, the program aiming to create the atomic bomb that would later devastate Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It was on his way back from Europe that President Truman announced to an astonished world that an entirely new force had now come under Anglo-American control.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
But this moment in Chicago is not only the beginning of nuclear weapons, it's also the first step towards the peaceful use of nuclear power as a form of energy, a breakthrough that will shape science, technology, and somehow even human exploration of space.
Will this power, now available to man, bring another, even more suicidal war upon us? Or can it be made to rule out war and open a new, progressive chapter of history, the atomic age? Those seem to be the alternatives.
Welcome to Euronews Tech Talks, the podcast that explores the digital, technological, and scientific landscape shaping Europe. I'm your host, Euronews Science correspondent Jeremy Wilkes. Today, we kick off our journey into the world of space and energy, navigating hotly discussed, polarizing, and fundamentally fascinating topics. We'll try to clear up some doubts, outline the challenges and opportunities, and explore where the hype meets reality. All of this by talking with European experts. Specifically, today, we'll explore nuclear energy in space. Is the idea of a nuclear reactor on the moon reality or science fiction? Do we actually need this project? What would that look like? Is NASA's plan to deploy it by 2030 truly feasible? And where does Europe stand? So wherever you are, get comfortable, turn up the volume, and let's begin.
Duffy to announce nuclear reactor on the moon.
NASA to put nuclear reactor on the moon by 2030, says US media.
NASA is getting fired up about a nuclear reactor on the moon.
Space Race 2.0, US fast-tracking plans to build nuclear reactor on the moon.
These are some of the international headlines that appeared in the news during the first days of August 2025. The US Transportation Secretary and NASA's acting administrator, Sean Duffy, released a directive to accelerate plans to build a nuclear reactor on the moon, setting 2030 as the target date for launch. For those who are not familiar with space, this news comes as a shock and prompted questions about the safety of having a nuclear power plant on Earth's natural satellite. for others, it raised doubts about America's strategy and the reasons for building a nuclear reactor in space. But let's try to bring some clarity. Firstly, the idea of using nuclear power in space is not new.
Well, it's been considered for many decades, actually, since the very early stages of space exploration.
You're listening to Professor Simon Middleburgh, co-director of the Nuclear Futures Institute at the University of Bangor in the United Kingdom.
Even things like the lunar missions, the Apollo missions back in the 60s and 70s, used small radiothermal generators, small mini nuclear systems to generate electricity. And when we started looking at going to Mars back in the mid-1900s, we started thinking about how we would get there. There was programs looking at nuclear propulsion and things like that. So it's not something new. However, that declined away. Nuclear technology became less sexy, less looked at. And with the revival in the space race, and with the revival in us potentially moving on to looking at missions to Mars again, we again found a reason to look to nuclear power again.
Whether in the form of radioisotope power systems, nuclear propulsion engines, or compact reactors, nuclear energy has long been on the radar of space experts. In this sense, NASA's current project to build a nuclear reactor on the Moon by 2030 has roots that date back to even before the Apollo missions. In fact, in 1965, the US launched SNAP-10A, the first nuclear reactor in space, which operated for 43 days before being shut down due to a technical issue. But what exactly would this energy be used for?
It's electricity and power for doing things on the Moon. Now, if you're going to have a permanent moon base there, it means that we're going to have permanent people there permanently, and they are going to need to not only survive and cook and have heat there, they're also going to need to generate their own water and recycle water. They're probably going to need to grow their own food, and they're going to probably need things like telecommunications and those sorts of things all need to be done on that moon base. Now, what else might happen is that the moon base might be generating fuel for the onward trip to Mars, so the Beyond Artemis projects. So if we treat the moon base as a stepping stone to Mars, and that's being considered, then it's a way of, if we find water on the moon, we can use the electricity generated by the nuclear reactor and the heat generated by the nuclear reactor as well to split the water into its component parts, oxygen for breathing and hydrogen for the fuel, or hydrogen and oxygen for that rocket fuel. So it's a major part of the puzzle, is just getting enough energy there so that we can do those important things for the missions.
NASA's next step in lunar exploration will be Artemis 2, a mission that will send 4 astronauts on a 10-day trip around the Moon in February 2026, according to the agency's current schedule. This will be followed by Artemis 3, featuring a lunar landing to explore the Moon's south pole, currently planned for 2027. After that, the goal is to establish a permanent presence on the Moon and to continue exploring space even further. To fulfill all of these objectives, access to energy is crucial. But why choose nuclear over other options?
Nuclear power is something that is dispatchable. You can turn it on and turn it off whenever you like. You're not at the whims of the solar cycle. There's no wind on the Moon, unfortunately, so you can't have wind turbines generating power. And there's not much obvious geothermal energy on the Moon as well that we can go at. So nuclear power represents something we can turn on and off. Now, the other side of it is it's really dense. Nuclear power is special because of that fission energy. You're creating millions of electron volts per reaction compared to an electron volt if it was a chemical reaction like you had with petrochemicals, diesel, and things like that. So the power density is huge. The transportability is there and it's dispatchable. And there's nothing that quite fits that bill of items other than nuclear power really for the Moon and for beyond that.
Nuclear fission, the only type of nuclear reaction we can currently produce on Earth through the division of the nucleus of an atom, offers invaluable advantages for fueling space exploration. But it's not the only type of energy experts are trying to develop. Here's astrophysicist Alfredo Carpineti, senior science writer and space correspondent at IFL Science.
It is not the only way to have a permanent base on the moon. Solar panels are another excellent solution. The complication there is, can we get them in a place that always gets sunlight, like the peaks of eternal light, which is areas near the South Pole, rims of crater that always have sunlight. But those are few, and so it's very prime real estate on the moon. It could be a combination of solar panels and batteries, and that will allow you to have different locations on the moon, no matter the long 14 days long lunar nights. Or it could be a combination of solar panels, batteries, and nuclear power generation.
Just as with solar panels on the moon, building, launching, and activating a nuclear reactor there is no easy task. Simon Middleburgh explains why.
The problem with the moon is that on Earth, we use the atmosphere as the ultimate heat sink. So it generates all that heat inside the reactor, and we need to go somewhere. And there's no atmosphere on the moon. There's nowhere to send that. So the reactors on the moon are either going to work by putting the waste heat into the moon regolith, the soil, or they'll use radiators. So big, almost like fan-like things to radiate the heat away from the reactor itself. But there's lots of people working on exactly how it looks and designing it right as well. It'll ultimately follow the engineering. It's also the temperature variation on the moon between nighttime and daytime on the moon changes once a month. So every 2 weeks, it goes from light to dark, and you get a massive temperature swing with that. So just understanding and developing the system so that they can work within that massive temperature swing is something that needs to be engineered into it. Transport is really important. So you remember from the Apollo 11 mission and Neil Armstrong sort of hitting the moon quite hard. It was a hard landing. This thing needs to be really robust. We need to be able to make sure that it's, when it does get dynamic loading, when you do shake it and when you launch it and things like that, it remains intact. So there's going to be lots of work that is done here on Earth before we launch anything to make sure that that reactor and the whole system around it is really, really safe to use. And we also want to make sure that it's repairable up there. So astronauts on the moon should be able to do some light maintenance to make sure that it is safe to continue to operate as well.
Despite these challenges, Middleburgh remains optimistic that NASA will meet its 2030 deadline.
It's a very racy timescale. Now, the benefit of this is that these are very small systems. So what we would like to do is we would like to build something pretty soon, operate it here on Earth so that we understand how it behaves, take it through its dynamic loading and things like that, so that we have got confidence to put it on to one of the Artemis rockets to send to the moon. So 2030 is a racy timescale. It is achievable. It just needs that sustained effort.
In contrast, Carpineti has a more cautious and skeptical position.
The US plan to have it won in 2030. It's completely unrealistic. It's 4 years away. And so far, we don't even have a way to reliably land on the moon. Yes, there have been some successful soft land, but also we have several soft land that have ended up with spacecraft on the side. A few landing that just crash landing. So you have this really complex scenario. You want to put a big and powerful nuclear reactor, which is going to be designed to survive the journey to space and then the landing, but you also need to stick the landing. If you cannot guarantee that you can do that, we have a problem. Hopefully, it's going to be designed that if a crash land is not going to be anything dramatic. It's not like you're throwing a bomb at the moon, but it still raises concern that it can be done properly. We can be excited. We can think that this is a crucial step for a long-term human habitation of the moon, but I do not feel that a strict deadline and a rush to get that done by the strict deadline when there are so many issues, without even considering the geopolitics of nuclear reactors on the moon, I think that is detrimental to the plan of having long-term habitation in space.
Geopolitics often appears in media coverage analysing acting NASA Administrator Duffy's decision to accelerate the project of a nuclear reactor on the moon. And according to Carpineti, it just cannot be ignored.
I think that the Trump administration very much want to be seen that they are doing something and they are trying to do something faster than China and Russia. But at the same time, the Trump administration has cut so much funding from NASA. And so you have this dichotomy that a lot of science missions are getting cut, that there is a lot less investment in NASA, but they still want to be seen that they are doing something that are there with all the other major players. There's also consideration on the only treaty that comes into play when it comes to space, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, and how would a nuclear reactor on the surface of the moon would work within that. It is clear that, according to the treaty, no country can own a plot of land on another world, but also if you have a nuclear reactor, you might want to say, don't come here, this is ours, because it's a safety risk. We cannot just pretend this is just about the science or the engineering or the interest in the challenge. This is a big and important political arena, and I think we cannot ignore it.
NASA's decision to accelerate its lunar nuclear power plant project came after China and Russia strengthened their space cooperation in May of this year. The two nations signed a memorandum to build an automated nuclear power station on the moon by 2035. But in this geopolitical and scientific landscape, there's one actor we haven't mentioned yet: Europe.
I'm Francesco Lodi from ENEA in Italy. I'm a researcher in the nuclear department and specifically in the laboratory which handles the design of nuclear reactor systems for energy production.
ENEA is the Italian National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development. ENEA, together with Thales Alenia Space Italia and the Department of Energy at the Polytechnic University of Milan, is working on Selene, a project funded by the Italian Space Agency.
The focus of the project is what we call the Moon Energy Hub, which is the energy infrastructure dedicated to supporting all the energy needs of a future lunar outpost on the moon surface. So tackling both the production, the storage, and the transmission of mainly electrical, but also possible thermal energy for all the needs of the user. Basically, the production is, in our vision, handled by a nuclear fission reactor.
The US, China, and Russia are not the only countries to look at how to build a nuclear reactor on the moon. The Italian Space Agency is also investigating this possibility, and so are private companies like Rolls-Royce in the UK. But what exactly would this reactor look like, and how would it differ from the terrestrial fission systems?
These are unique reactors, especially if we compare them to the technologies that are the standard here on Earth. So, for example, terrestrial plants are of the order of the gigawatts electric power. Now, there's talk about so-called small modular reactors, which small is still hundreds of megawatts of powers. Then there's talk of microreactors for specific applications, and those are several tens of megawatts of power. So if we should talk about the space reactors for lunar application, we should call them nanoreactors, because they are several tens or some hundreds of kilowatts of power. So they're extremely small compared to any kind of application that is currently in discussion for Earth applications. And of course, the size has a huge impact on the design and on the structure of the reactor itself. So the reactors are very small, are extremely compact. For example, they could fit in a room of a standard building in all-inclusive, let's say, not only the core of the system, but all the reactor and all that is needed for the power produced to be transferring as electricity will be very compact. And the main difference, besides size, is also the fact that on the Earth we have an atmosphere, so we produce heat, we convert that to electricity, but thermodynamics tell us that we cannot convert every ounce of heat into electricity, so some get lost in inefficiencies. And this heat is dissipated in water, for example, of rivers or in air when possible. But that's not possible on the moon surface because there's no water, there's no air, there's nothing. Dissipating that heat is a completely different challenge and completely different approach must be think for this kind of systems.
The small size and compact nature of the nuclear reactor poses a major challenge for Lodi's team, which also faces the task of making the system operate as autonomously as possible. Another crucial aspect which Lodi and his team need to pay attention to is the choice of materials.
It's extremely challenging for materials because we are kind of merging two of the most challenging industries on the planet, which is the space industries, which needs to have like very strong material in terms of mechanical resistance, but also very light materials, because to give you a number, to put a kilogram on the moon is $1 million for a kilogram. The materials must be light. It's extremely important from the economic standpoint. And we are also merging with the nuclear war. So we have neutrons and radiation, which damages can damage materials. We are facing the challenges of finding materials that are able to withstand high temperatures for a long period of times, because the reactor life, we don't want that to be 1 year, 2 years. We are targeting at least 10 years. Since the materials will operate at very high temperatures, we are looking at particular material called trisofuel, which stands for triisotropic fuel, which is a specific type of material, not the standard for reactor terrestrial applications, but so an innovative fuel which has this capability to operate at high temperature while confining the radioactive source terms produced by the fission event.
Nuclear power is already quite a divisive topic on Earth, with many people concerned about safety hazards and waste. But according to Lodi, when it comes to building a nuclear reactor on the moon, there's little cause for worry.
What can happen and what we are studying and what it is required for licensing, for make it happen to have a nuclear reactor on board a spacecraft to launch it, is, of course, taking into account possible spacecraft malfunctioning scenarios. And the most catastrophic scenario one can think is, of course, the explosion of the spacecraft. So not of the reactor, but of the spacecraft that's carrying it before it leaves the Earth biosphere. That's a scenario that we have to include in the design and design provisions. But to that, I want to add that maybe it's not very known, but we live in a world nowadays where more than 80 nuclear devices have been launched into space as I speak. Half of them have been actual nuclear reactors on board satellites, mostly launched by former Soviet Union. The last was launched in 1988. And the other half is so-called radioisotope heat or thermoelectric generator. These radioisotope generators typically rely on the decay of heavy metal, which emits a lot of radiation, or at least type of radiation which is easy to recover as heat, and then that heat can be used as is or transformed into energy, electrical energy. A nuclear reactor, instead using uranium, will have radioactive inventory, which is around 1 million times less. And these devices can be launched, shut down, because we can control the chain reaction. So those are elements which greatly simplify the management from a design standpoint of this type of scenarios of spacecraft malfunctioning. because the only concern that you have is to make sure that the reactor does not start itself during this process, and that it's something that can be done in design. There are various ways. So it is something that is a concern and must be handled, but I think it can be safely handled with reduced risk, especially if compared to other type of nuclear technologies which are launched nowadays.
The Selene project is currently in the design phase of the nuclear reactor. Unlike the United States, China and Russia, ENEA's team is targeting the deployment of a nuclear reactor on the Moon by the late 2030s. But Lodi does not see this as a competition.
The idea here is really to, first of all, strengthen the Italian position into this type of context, because before this project, there was not much in the sense of power sources for lunar outpost. Then extend the outreach to all European stakeholders in order to really propel this project into a more realistic sphere of realization. And then from there, let's say only imagination is the bound, because of course, the main programs that are currently targeting the moon surface are the Artemis program, which is led by the US, but in which the European Space Agency has a strong role, and the Chinese program, which is in conjunction with the Russian Space Agency. So at some point, the interaction with these players will be, I think, will be important.
It was a dense episode, but we hope we managed to provide some clarity and insight into the topic of nuclear energy on the Moon. We understand that there's nothing particularly new or radical about the idea of placing a nuclear reactor in space. Its deployment, however, will not happen tomorrow or in the near future. There are target deadlines, but as we know, they can change and slip. What's certain is that just like during the time of the Chicago Pile 1 in the 1940s, nuclear energy, even in space, can shape power relations and transform life for people on Earth. Here's Alfredo Carpineti.
Obviously, if you are designing a compact, safe, efficient nuclear fusion reactor, you could benefit certain places on Earth, places that might not get enough sunlight or enough wind, so you cannot have those kind of renewable energies. But still, if you want a low carbon emission energy production, that could be it. This is why it has such an interesting potential. And I feel that we really need to get it right.
That's all for today's episode of Euronews Tech Talks. If you want to learn more about the topic of nuclear energy on Earth, check out our episodes 33, 34, and 35. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another topic exploring the relationship between space, energy, and the economy around space-based solar power. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Jeremy Wilks. This series was created by Marta Rodriguez Martinez. This episode was written and produced by Alice Carnevale. The theme music is by Léo Lebrun. Sound editing and sound mixing is by Johan Breton. Our editor-in-chief is Niaz Samadizadeh. If you aren't already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on the Euronews YouTube channel. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving us a positive review and, of course, sharing it. Thanks for listening.